Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Or is it a Chinese surveillance balloon? Well, according to the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the United States government has detected and tracking a high-altitude surveillance balloon that was seen flying over Billings, Montana on Thursday. Now, a spokesperson for the Pentagon says they have been keeping an eye on the balloon for several days and say that it's traveling at an altitude well above commercial air traffic and does not present a military or physical threat to people on the ground. Now, President Joe Biden was briefed on the balloon and took military advice to not take it down due to the risk to the safety and security of people on the ground from possible debris. Now, Chinese authorities have confirmed it was a civilian airship intended for scientific research. Well, this comes, of course, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken was set to meet President Xi Jinping in Beijing in the coming days. But now the Biden administration has decided to postpone Blinken's upcoming trip to Beijing following the news of that balloon. Now, any future conversation between the two would make Blinken the first U.S. secretary to sit down with the Chinese leader in nearly 6 years and the first of President Joe Biden's cabinet secretaries to visit China. Well, for more on this, we welcome in Zongyuan Zoe Liu, Counsel on Foreign Relations Fellow for International Political Economy, as well as the author of Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China's Finances Its Global Ambitions. Good to have you on, Zoe. So obviously, you have this complication here with this trip being postponed. What should we read into this? Will you try and sort of characterize it as to really this sort of disjointed relationship that the Biden administration has had with Beijing?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rochelle, for having me. I would the postponed trip, to be honest, I'm not necessarily surprised, to be honest. Part of this is because, on the one hand, neither China nor the United States have officially confirmed that Secretary Blinken is going to go to China, even his trip is supposedly to start tomorrow, right? Then on the other hand, obviously, the complication of the balloon situation did not help at all. But on top of this, remember what has been happening in the background. There are a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. On one hand, there is the scheduled House Speaker visit to Taiwan, and there is also a series of U.S. export controls against Chinese entities, and in particular highlighted Huawei. And then finally, as of yesterday, the United States announced that we gained four additional base access in the Philippines. So a lot of this really did not surprise me. And this goes back to your point. This adds a lot of strain to the bilateral relationship.
So, I mean, when you have a backdrop like that and you have this visit that was supposed to take place, what really is at stake here? And what does this visit actually mean for the U.S. China relationship? Is it a resetting, or are the expectations too high for that?
Oh, that's a great question, Rochelle. And I think reset is actually the word that many foreign policy communities, both here in America and in China, would be really looking forward to. And if anything, you remember when the President Biden came into office back in 2021, the Chinese officials were really looking forward to a reset in the bilateral relations. But unfortunately, so far, we haven't seen this. And even before Secretary Blinken postponed his trip, a lot of the public opinions and the commentators or state-run media commenting on the prospective of his visit the expectations was very, very, very low because of all these things happening in the background.
And so we're likely not going to see some of the more complex issues with this first visit when it does take place. But what is supposed to be on the agenda for this visit?
So supposedly, I would say the bottom line is that both sides have very different expectations. In other words, the expectation gap is relatively wide. So on the one hand, the United States would expect that they would on the one hand meet high level new generation of Chinese leaders, and they would also want to reaffirm the agreement during the Biden-Xi meeting alongside the G20 summit last year. And they probably also would want to touch upon the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine, how to end the war, the role of China. And then probably they would also want to ask China to end the series of the sanction measures imposed on U.S. entities and U.S. individuals after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. And in other words, a lot of these are meant to put a bottom line to prevent a crisis between U.S. China in the relationship between United States and China. However, what the Chinese government and Chinese officials are really looking forward to is to, on the one hand, making sure that, well, crisis management, putting a bottom line is not enough. They are really looking forward to have exactly as what you are saying, reset in the relationship. And more specifically, they want probably the United States to acknowledge or respect what China considers as its core interest, especially with regard to Taiwan and other sensitive issues such as Xinjiang.
And when you speak of core issues, and you mentioned Taiwan, obviously the biggest semiconductor chip producer in the world, but then you have, the Biden administration tightening its rules of certain U.S. technologies to China, starting to have talk of some limited investments in China as well. And then, so what does that mean then? I mean, I'm assuming we're not going to have that conversation at this sort of meeting if we want to see any sort of progress. But how does that dynamic, do you think, play out?
So that's a very interesting question you asked, Rochelle. And you are absolutely right. Semiconductor is really right to the core of the conversation right now here. However, I would say for us, the United States interest in Taiwan is not necessarily to protect Taiwan on its own. I've been arguing this for a long time that our interest in Taiwan is not Taiwan per se or Taiwan sovereignty or whatever. Our interest in Taiwan is really from our own interests, supply chain and American business interests, and to what extent the semiconductor supply chain actually fit into United States national security interest. And from that perspective, actually, China sees it very similar as well. But on top of that, in addition to semiconductor, or let me step back, regardless whether Taiwan has or has not a semiconductor, China's perception or China's interest in Taiwan has always been, or how the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese policymakers consider Taiwan as part of China. And that is something that Chinese leaders would not negotiate.
And as you mentioned, they're coming from two very sort of interests there when it comes to Taiwan. But as we mentioned, things like geopolitical tensions, one of the reasons that we're starting to see some of these companies, some U.S. companies, diversifying their supply chains away from China. But there are obviously other factors at play as well. Break some of those down for us.
So, that's a great question, Rochelle, again. So in terms of, I would say, the core of your question really is about, factors at play that might have accelerated decoupling, right? So on the one hand, in addition to all these geopolitics and all that, I would also say that actually from business interest perspective, pure market dynamic perspective, decoupling or for that matter, supply chain relocation already happened before U.S. China trade war. And the pure reason for that from market perspective is really because labor costs in China has increased, land costs. In other words, what made China attractive as a global manufacturing center is no longer there. And then on top of that, there has also been a lot of major policy swings from President Xi Jinping's discussion of a common prosperity, the crackdown on the tech sector. A lot of these uncertainties made it seems that China is no longer welcoming international business, despite that the Chinese government and the NDRC, the NDRC State Council consistently say, actually, we are still interested in international investment. So policy major swings adds to business uncertainty, and business don't like that. And then finally, COVID really seals the deal in terms of major supply chain disruptions.
So a lot at play here, a complex relationship. We'll have to see what happens if Secretary Blinken does eventually make it to Beijing. A big thank you there for your insights. Zongyuan Zoe Liu there, Counsel on Foreign Relations, Fellow for International Political Economy. Thank you so much.